All right. Welcome to the PeopleSoft nVision Tips and Tricks webinar. I see we've got a lot of people already on, and I know there's a lot more that are registered, so we'll probably see a few jumping on here in the next few minutes, but we're going to get started. Thanks for joining us this morning. Excited to talk to you with new thoughts and topics on a very old subject, which is nVision. So we're excited to talk to you guys today about that. Just a quick note about SpearMC. Most of you guys already know about us, but just a quick message about us. We are Oracle Platinum Partner. We are obviously in the PeopleSoft space, heavy in with financials, HCM, etc. Do a lot of Oracle Cloud infrastructure work and managed services. So that's really our bread and butter, although we have other topics and areas that we cover as well. But really, PeopleSoft has been our bread and butter. It's how we got started and how we still continue to focus our time. We are coast to coast, and I'll introduce myself in a second, but I'm in the Seattle office. But we do have offices around the country, and we've been expanding slowly, and you can see that recently we have expanded on the East Coast with Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh, and we are excited to have more presence back on the East Coast. So very excited about that too. All right, so today, your presenters, that's me at the top, Cameron McClurg. I am from Seattle, Managing Director. I've been using PeopleSoft since about 1998, and I think I started with nVision as one of my first topics, doing general ledger work in nVision. So I've been using nVision for a little over 20 years, and it's interesting. It's such a versatile tool that I keep finding new things and new use cases, and even as part of researching for this webinar, I discovered a couple of new cool little things. So very, very interesting. And Steve, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Thank you, Cameron. Steve Kelly here. I'm a Managing Director with SpearMC out of Denver, and I have been in the PeopleSoft space since beginning of 1996, and very familiar with building nVision reports way back then, and continue even up to the current time.
All right, great. Thanks, Steve. Steve and I, obviously, we also use the same barber. So that's something that Steve and I got going for us. So anyway, let's get in here. So, all right, nVision tips and tricks. This webinar today, not necessarily designed for beginners, people that are looking for the basics about nVision. We're really looking for people that have been using nVision, maybe have written some nVision reports themselves, perhaps looking to take it to the next level and do some cool things with their reports. It does assume a basic understanding of the nVision concepts like layout, scopes, and Plosion. But if you are on this webinar and are in more of a beginner mode and want to go through training, we do have a 2-day training on nVision that really starts from the beginning and works through layouts, scopes, Plosion, drill down, all of that stuff. And so that training is part of our live virtual training. Of course, we can't do on-site training right now, but we are doing live virtual training. Our normal training on-site would be longer, and so this live virtual training is shorter. It is so nVision is going to be 2 days. We do have some other training classes you can see here. So we've got a whole series on decustomization, PTF. We've got query that's in very small chunks. So from 101, 201, 301, pivot grids, and then we do lease administration, which is actually a 3-day class. So between all of these, the idea is to do them in very small bite-sized chunks so that people can fit them into their schedule. I think the decustomization and query classes are actually in 4-hour chunks. So they're very, very small chunks for you to kind of just get in and learn some really good stuff. It's a little longer format than a webinar. And so we are doing it at a discount. These are starting at $295, very low price point, and we're hoping to bring some of our great training content in a shorter time period and a lower price point for everybody. So that is in our on our website, and so you can see here, and you will get this handout later on in this session, or you'll get it right afterwards. We'll send this deck out, and you'll get this link to go take a look at the training. On this page that you go to, you'll see the section for live virtual training. You can drill into each of these areas and see some more information, the abstract, the agenda, and then a link to sign up if you'd like to. All right, let's get into nVision. All right, so we're going to talk through 5 specific examples, and each of these go into a bit of detail. But you know, of course, there's 100 different topics that we could do. We had to pick just a few, and so we've got these 5, and we didn't quite make it in with a quarter to date example, which has always been a bugaboo for people that are doing nVision reports. But we do have some slides at the very end. If we get to it, we'll talk through it. If not, we have some bullets and some how-tos of the query to date feature in essentially the appendix. All right, so let's take a look. We're going to go through personalizations. We're going to look at how to take control of your NVS user experience and for all your users. We're going to take a look, and Steve will take over and do some topics around using non-ledger data. So both in Tabular, which is a pretty straightforward example, but Steve's got some nuance to it to show you how you can do some really cool things with it. And then he'll be looking at how to use non-ledger data in the matrix format, which is always something that is a little bit next level. And then I got a really cool example about using scopes to actually email personalized reports to people, which is something you won't find in PeopleBooks. And so I got some examples and some how-to on how to do that. And then we'll finish up with example of instance hooks and how those can be used to meet your guys' needs. All right, let's get into it. So let's talk about personalization. So really, personalizations in nVision are really about taking control of your NVS user file. It's doing things like fixing the menu for your drill downs. It's fixing the opening page when you get into it. And it's really, you know, I want to give you guys some how-to on how to share your updates and changes with other people. That's really important. I've noticed that when we work with a lot of folks that are doing nVision, and they either just take the standard nVision page or the login page, or they perhaps make some changes, but they don't know how to share with others. So we're going to talk through those. All right, so first thing, before you go to make any changes with your NVS user file, you really need to save the file locally. Otherwise, a lot of times what will happen is when you're logging in nVision, it'll open up a read-only version of your NVS user. So you can try to make changes, but you can't actually save those changes and then have those changes persist for the next time you open it up. So that's the first thing you're going to do. You're going to open up your file. You're going to save it locally. And if your thought here is that you're making changes on behalf of all users, you're going to work with your IT group or your administrators to move that file back in and overwrite the existing NVS user file. If it's for you only, you can modify your configuration manager to point only at your copy of NVS user. And of course, you can always daisy chain with semicolons. So I'm going to show you all this stuff and show you what I'm talking about here. All right, so first thing you're going to do is when you go into open up nVision, you know on your desktop you'll have an Excel file and you'll have your NVS user icon down the menu. Normally people don't open that NVS user or don't know what that's for. That's actually the nVision program that's there. So if you click on that, you'll actually have this ability to go to this Go and then Configuration. This is going to open up your Configuration Manager file. So either you already know how to open up your Configuration Manager or you're going to go in here. And what you'll notice here is when you come in here, you click on Profile and then Edit. And when you go in here, the nVision tab, you'll notice that you have all these different directory paths. So the key one here is under the Customization Macros. This is where it's going to be looking for your NVS user file, okay? Now, if you have your own file and your own customized version of the NVS user file, which we're going to show how to make some changes to that here in a second, then you're going to want to put that in a layout, in a directory that you can see. You'll want to put that location first for the standard location that you had previously. So here you can see I've got this little location for CPS layouts, and so I can have my own NVS user file that's going to open up before the one perhaps that opens up for everybody else. Okay, so you just put in your location, you daisy chain. This is something you could do even with layouts, with drill downs, etc. Okay, all right. So once you do that, you're going to save your file. You're going to put it in this location, and the next time you open up nVision, it will open up your NVS user file and not the one that perhaps everybody else is doing. Okay, so alternatively, here's an interesting little tip. You can create customized versions of the NVS user file for different groups within your organization. So for example, let's say accounting has their version that has their drill downs and standard reports that they use. Perhaps you also have a different one for, let's say, a PMO group or some kind of departmental group. You can create different versions of that, and then through the shortcut feature, when you drop the shortcut onto people's desktops, you can append using this little feature here at the end. In fact, actually, I take that back. The link there is wrong. You actually have to put SF before the NVS user file. By doing that, it will open up the other file. I'll get that corrected in the slides. So if you do that, then you can create customized versions of the NVS user and allow different groups to use that. So let me show you some of the perhaps personalizations that you might make for the different groups. Okay, for the first thing, menu cleanup. I can't tell you how many people we come into, how many clients we work with that have not touched their menus. And I always ask the same question: why? I don't think even Oracle thinks that you'll be using these drill down menus or drill down layouts as they are. They're pretty hideous if you ever try them. They've got a real bright blue background with a yellow font. I mean, it's just terrible. So we always tell people, man, clean those up, get rid of them. So the way you do that, very simple. You go to your PS menu tab here in your NVS user file, and you simply toggle the yes and no on this active column. Once you make those changes, you can simply rebuild the menu, and you will get a then customized version of the menu. Very simple to do. The Y in the end. You can even delete the rows if you just want to get rid of them. So you can keep the ones you want, hide the ones you don't want. Okay, that's fine. But let's say you have your own drill downs, and you really should have your own drill downs, things that are specific to your business, specific to your chart field, specific to your data. So the way you're going to do that, first thing to note is, again, remember that your drill down layouts need to be in the location that the config manager is pointing to. So in this drill down layouts, this is the location where it's going to look for your drill downs. And if you put that in, again, you can daisy chain, so you can put in your own location first. So if you have your own private departmental drill downs, you can put that in a departmental share before it goes to the standard generic one. And then you're going to call out that layout in that menu tab by simply giving it a label, calling out the actual layout file, and then you're going to, and then a little description on the right. And if you do that, again, you rebuild the menu, and now you'll notice that AP, AM, and GL detail drill down that is in your menu. And again, that is a way to bring your drill downs in here, as opposed to clicking on the drill down, then finding your layout. I mean, oftentimes people have the same drill downs they use all the time. So definitely take the 5 minutes or 1 minute to update your NVS user file and get those drill downs in there. All right, lastly, really simple, but you can add buttons. And here in this case, I've created this very simple button for Run Requisition Report. Again, under the idea that you might create customized versions of this for different groups in your organization, you could really make it really easy to not require your users to have to go in and run a report request and find the right report request, et cetera. Just give them a button, run the requisition report, or for a PMO, run the project budget report, or whatever you have. Make it easy. Put those buttons on. I didn't even show you how to do it because you click on the add buttons and it couldn't be easier. You just simply tell it which report request you want to run. Okay, that's it for personalizations. So let's go to the next topic, and that's back to Steve for the use non-ledger tables in Tabular. I'm going to change the presenter and give him the ability to drive here. All right, Steve, go ahead.
Thank you, Cameron. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to talk through the first topic here is using non-ledger tables in a tabular report. So within nVision, as Cameron mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is for those who are somewhat familiar with nVision, but the training classes will go into more detail on the difference of the reports. But at a very high level, there's two types of reports, tabular versus matrix. And the tabular report is really just fed by a query, and you can have multiple tabular reports within one workbook. You can only have one matrix report within a workbook. Matrix is probably what most people in the audience are used to working with when you're reporting off your ledger and you're reporting off of financial data with columns set up as your periods or your years and your rows set up as the account or some other combination of filters on fields, chart fields. So let me jump in here and up here. A lot of folks who have been using PeopleSoft product for a while and even nVision for a while are only familiar with the matrix reports just because that's all their company has been reporting. But there is the ability to do tabular, as I mentioned. You can pull data from any query, not just ledger data. So I'm going to run through this part relatively quickly here. But the main steps to this is first, you got to build a query or take an existing query. Second step, open up your nVision. The one tip that I want to point out is if you just built your query and you already had nVision open, you're not going to see the query yet. So close out of nVision after you've built your query and come back in nVision, then you'll be able to see it from nVision. Then create your layout, and you're going to define it as a tabular type of layout. And then for the data source, instead of pointing to the ledger, which many of you probably have kind of scanned right over when you're building a matrix report before and not paid much attention to, but there is an ability to change that from a ledger default to pull from the query. After you do that, then you're going to highlight each column and pull from your query what field you want pulling into each column. So as a use case example, I took a query that was off of the flattened account rollup tree. And you could have the query, as I mentioned, any data. It doesn't have to be GL related. It could be supplier data. It could be customer data. It could be anything out there, HR data for that matter, and be able to pull in. Okay. The tabular layout fed by the query. In this example, the query is based on the custom report view that flattens the tree. And the query is going to produce one row per account with separate columns for each of the different rollup node levels. So that then you could use that within Excel if you wanted to do pivot grids of slicing and dicing based on different rollup levels of your tree. So here's a picture of just the basic account rollup tree from the demo database. Okay. And the query itself that it built is just going against the GL account table and linking that to the flattened tree. And this slide deck walks through what are the fields that we were selecting. And this is the result set when you run the query. And I have it organized by the structure of the tree itself. And I scroll down, you can see I'm on row 300 here off this tree right now. And on the far right, we have the account description, the account type, whether it's a control account or not. And then I have the different node levels 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the tree. And the event that the node only went down to like level 3, it would just repeat that level 3 value on level 4 and 5. Okay, so stepwise, after you've created your query, you're going to go in and open nVision. And when you come in there, then go to add-ins, nVision, new layout. I'm going to give my layout a name and then save it. First step I'm going to do is go to layout definition. And the key piece here is it defaults to the matrix layout sheet. I'm going to change that to say tabular layout sheet. And I'm going to pick my query source. And once I pick my query source, I'm going to highlight my first column in the report. And then I'm going to pick what field I want to pull in. In this case, I'm pointing to the tree name itself. I'm going to pull in that column. And I don't have to click OK and exit back out to the spreadsheet. I can use the little navigate buttons on the lower right there. I have circled with the right arrow and just go to the next column after I've applied it to the column B. And then I can pick the next column that I want to pull in and click apply, and then click the right arrow and then pick the next column, so on and so forth. So at the end, I have all the columns, or whichever columns I want in my query. I don't have to pick all of them. And when I'm ready, I am running the report, and this is the result of that report. So I could take data like this, and then I can have that drop into a workbook and be able to have pivot tables built off of this, slicing and dicing data, that sort of thing. Or if I had existing sources of data from other systems, this might be helpful for slicing and dicing data as well. One thing I want to point out is nVision layouts, while they're constrained to a single matrix type sheet, there is no limitation on the number of tabular type sheets. So the tabular sheets fed by queries can be useful for a variety of things. And number one that comes to mind is reconciliations. So if any of you are a project-based organization or are doing contracts and billing within the system as well, this would be helpful to be able to build a reconciliation report that can be run repeatedly each month, that would have separate sheets that are pulling data from the project area, pulling data from the contract area, pulling data from the GL area, and being able to reconcile data back and forth. You can even tie that together with instantiating a macro after it pulls data in and be able to do some further analysis on that data without you manually having to do it. Other things it could be useful for is lookup tables for use by other sheets in the workbook. So if you had other sources of data coming in and you wanted to look up data within the Oracle PeopleSoft system, you can do that. Also exporting data for other systems use. So the example of that flattened tree, that might be something that if you have another system that your interface is just a flat file or a spreadsheet upload that you're manipulating, if you wanted to be able to pass them data very quickly during the development phase without building a true interface, you could do this sort of things with the report as well. And then I mentioned earlier using it to build pivots, and those pivots could be instantiated by the macro to be refreshed as well. Here's that same example of the flattened tree, but adding some monetary columns in there. And so I added the dispatched PO amount in there, and then you could build a pivot off of that, slicing, dicing at any of the tree node roll-up levels. Okay, let's move on to the using non-ledger tables in a matrix report. This is a little more exciting. The tabular one is pretty straightforward there. The matrix report, which most people are used to building off of ledger data, a lot of folks aren't aware that you can build this off of a data source of a query. And the Plosion feature is limited to matrix type layouts. So while you might be able to get data off of that tabular report, similar types of data, you aren't able to do Plosion within a tabular report. So that's another nice feature of using the matrix report. The query is used in a matrix layout. The query must include at least one aggregate column, either a sum or a count. It can have more than one aggregated if you want. The aggregate column must have a heading. So when you're in nVision, you're pointing to that field via the heading. And for example, the use case I'm going to walk through is pulling from the purchasing area. And I have a query that is feeding data on PO counts and the PO amount spent. Generally speaking, queries used in matrix reporting should not contain much criteria. You want to do most of your filtering within the nVision matrix report or layout or in scopes you want to add on top of it to limit the information returned to the report. That way you can reuse your query on multiple different layouts. The use case I'm going to walk through is building a report off purchase order metrics and going to be listing by supplier, PO counts, the dollar spend, the average spend per PO for current year to date, prior year, same period, year to date, and since inception columns as well. Plus, added in columns, calculated columns to get the percent of each supplier's spend of the total spend, as well as getting a little bit fancy at the end there of being able to highlight rows that where the supplier has greater than X percent threshold. I chose a 15% threshold for my example here of the total spend. So here is the final report, and then I'll walk through how we got here. So if you look at this report, we have ran it as of a particular date, just like you do when you run a ledger report. Here's an as of date that you use. And what I have coming in here is, as I said, one row per supplier, and it is using the Plosion feature off of that. So and the layout itself really only had one row, and then it used Plosion to blow out all the different suppliers here. And then column-wise, we have PO counts, and we're looking at 3 different types of counts. We're looking at the year-to-date for the current year, the year-to-date for the prior year, and since inception, so all the prior years. And then similar on the monetary side, on the dollars spent that were dispatched, we have those 3 same measures of the current year, year-to-date, prior year, year-to-date, and since inception. And then have a calculated column there, column K, that is the percent of the overall spend since inception. You could also, if you wanted to, do percent overall spend for the current year, etc. I just did one for an example here. And then if you look, there are a few fields highlighted in yellow there. So the 45.1% on row 11 for Freed's Furniture, and the 17.7% on row 16 for Bernie's Bike Shop. Those are highlighted because they're greater than the threshold that I set, which was 15% of the total. The final section was the average spend, and this is also calculated fields in the nVision layout. So calculating the average spend for each of those 3 different measures of the year to date, for the current year, year to date, prior year, and inception to date. All right, steps to build. We're going to build the query for your data source first. Open nVision, as I mentioned before. If you have nVision open already and you're building the query, you need to exit out and come back in. You're going to create the new layout, and this time you're going to choose matrix as the layout. And you're going to pick your query source, and then step 6, you're going to be creating your headings and variables, similar to how you do when you're building a ledger-based report, giving your structure around your report first, and then start specifying your row and column criteria, and then do it in steps. So you get the basics down first, and then start adding things like formulas, adding labels. So in the report I have here, I had the supplier name, for example, listed in the supplier ID, that in order to make those appear in the imploded rows, you have to have labels in there as well. And then finally, just making it pretty. So the highlighting, like the conditional formatting that I put in there, that sort of thing. Okay, so first off, the query, how do we do that? So we're going to list by supplier, the PO counts, the spend, the average spend. Is what we want to get here. So building the query, built the query off of the supplier area, the vendor table, and then linking to the PO header table. And I took the PO date and I put the PO date into monthly periods by linking it to that C alias table is the calendar table. And I chose a particular monthly calendar and was able to drop the POs based on the PO date into periods. And then linking to the distribution line to get the amount itself. And I did pull into the query the department value as well, if you wanted to pull in various chart fields. In the example here, I don't have that in the report, but you could build a scope or filter the report off of that chart field for department, or pull other chart fields into your query as well. Okay, here's the fields that are coming into the query itself. And then the criteria, I filtered on POs that were in dispatched, approved, or closed out. And the SQL for that. Okay, so the query itself, what does that look like? That's kicking out, just like I said, 1 row per supplier, but it's also 1 row per year and period. So it's a little different than the finalized nVision report. I want to let nVision, based on the time spans that I set up, determine how I want to package this up, whether it's by period or by year to date, or what have you. Okay, so now I'm going to go back into nVision. All right. Doing a new layout, giving it a name. Okay. And the key here, when I go to defining the layout options, I am going to specify matrix layout. That is the default. Going to get in a set ID and business unit just for defaulting, prompting defaulting. And then I'm going to highlight the report as a whole. So if you click in the upper left corner of the sheet before you go to the layout definition, you can apply criteria to the entire sheet, just like you would when you're building a ledger-based matrix layout. I'm going to go to the source, and I'm going to specify query instead of ledger. And then I'm going to pick my query. Okay, and I'm going to pick a default. I don't have to necessarily pick a column and apply it to the sheet as a whole. I could apply it to individual columns or rows or what have you, but I am going to go ahead and pick a default as the PO count on the sheet as a whole here. Okay, and then I'm going to start putting some structure around my report. So these are similar steps to what I would do if I were building a report, matrix report based off a ledger. Start with putting some structure. So I'm going to start putting the column headings in here of what I want to see on my end report. Okay, little by little, adding to this. Okay, and then the next step, I'm going to add some variables that I'm going to be able to use in my headings on my report. So I'm going to pick an area that's out of view, and typically over to the far right and down a little bit on your report. And I'm going to put a couple different variables in. I just put a couple of the examples in here. RID being the report ID itself. When you're running it, RPT underscore title is what I called for the title. And so what I have in column Z there are what I'm going to be naming the variables. And then in column AA there is the actual variable name for PeopleSoft nVision. There are variables that are all 3 characters, and there's a percent in front, percent after to identify those system variables. So PED is period and date. So depending on what as of date, whenever you run a report, you specify an as of date. So it's going to determine that period and date based on that as of date that I specify at runtime of the report. Okay. And next step I'm going to do is I'm going to name those variables, give them names with Excel naming function. And so I'm going to highlight just the section, not the heading section there, but just the actual values themselves. And then I'm going to go to formulas and create from selection. And by default, top row and left column is checked. I'm going to uncheck that top row because all I want to do is pick the left column and have that be the name of the values that are in the right-hand column of my selection. Okay. So once I've done that, I'm going to double check and make sure that that got in the name manager okay in Excel. So formulas name manager. And you can see I have the 5 fields. With one step of highlighting all the fields together, I was able to create all these names. Alternatively, you could go in and you could create one name at a time. The reason I'm doing this is that I'm going to be, when I'm building my report, constantly inserting rows, inserting columns. And I also don't want to, when I'm referring to a variable within my report, I don't necessarily want to be pointing to cell ZZ10 and have to remember what that was. I'd prefer to be able to just point to a name and say, okay, I'm going to pull in PED here for period and date, or pull in the RPT underscore title for report title. Okay, so next I'm going to use these variables in the headings. So let me go back to the top left of the report, and then I'm going to start adding in some of these variables that we just created. So in cell C3 here, I typed in equals RPT underscore title. and enter. It converted it to what is the value for that named value of report title. It represents %RQT%, which is the nVision variable that represents the report title that is on your report request when you go to submit the request for the report. Okay, so that report title, once again, came from that variable section of the sheet. Okay, next I'm going to put the what period for the period ending date based on the report as of date when you submit the report to run. It's going to take that and evaluate the period end date, and I am using some combination of the variable name, so PED, but also just Excel formatting and concatenation. So I'm taking the literal string for the period ending that is in double quotes there, and using the concatenation ampersand. And then I'm using the text function in order to take that period end date and put it into a certain format so that this would come out as, if I ran it for December 31st, it would come out as December spelled out. 31st, comma, year. Okay. And typically on most reports, I want to have some kind of standard heading. So what I have there is report title, the period ending date that you're running it for, and then the upper right corner, typically putting when was the report run. So if someone saves this report and emails it to someone, at least you know, okay, at what point in time was it run? Because you might be looking at a report that was run a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and the data has since then changed. And so you want to be able to know that. So that's why I always add these variables in of run date and run time. Okay, and once again, using Excel functions of stringing together strings, literal strings, like run date is in double quotes, and then using the concatenation ampersand, and then using the text function to format what I want that date to look like. Similar type of thing for the time. Okay, next, after I have my base headings and columns kind of defined, then I'm going to start defining my criteria. And I typically start in the columns. You could start in the rows. I like to start in the columns first. And I'm going to highlight an entire column. So I pick the year-to-date, current year, and then add in nVision layout definition. And on the columns, typically specifying the time span. So in this case, I'm pointing to the YTD time span, which is for year-to-date. So that is relative to the report runtime as of date. That is, if I run the report as of November 30, it's going to show me all data from period 0 up until period 11, presuming you're going off a calendar that is monthly based. Okay, and I can then use the arrow after I apply to each column. I can use the arrows to navigate to the next column over, or specify the time span for that column, YTD minus 1 year, for example. So that's the same period of the prior year and pulling year to date. And then the third value I'm looking for is inception to date. Okay, similarly on the spend, so if you notice on the PO count, I didn't specify the query or the field that I'm pulling from because I already specified that on the sheet as a whole. I didn't need to do that at the column level. Within nVision, for those of you who aren't thoroughly familiar with it, the definition of what comes into a cell in nVision is based on the intersection of criteria at your sheet as a whole, which is your upper left corner of the sheet, combined with your column criteria, combined with your row criteria. And there is an order of precedence of what overrides what. So the row overrides the column overrides the sheet if you happen to have the same criteria specified on more than one area. So in this case, on this monetary spend column, I do want to override what field am I pulling from. I don't want to pull from the PO counts that was at the sheet level. I want to pull from the dollar spend. A little hard to see with the blue background there, but that is dollar spend is the field I was selecting against there. And then I'm going to specify the time span, just like I did on the other one. So I have year to date here, and then specifying year to date minus 1 year, for example, and then inception to date. Okay, next is the row criteria. So then I'm going to go down and I'm going to highlight a row on my report. And this report, building this one, I only built one row because I'm going to be using an Plosion feature to have that blow out what are the individual suppliers. I didn't want to specify specifically what the supplier names were or IDs were to filter on, because that's going to be constantly changing. So I'm telling it, you'll see, to pull all detail values that are coming in from the query data source. So I'm going to highlight the entire row, and then I'm going to go to the layout definition, and I'm going to go to the filter tab. And the one trick here is you do need to know the names of the fields that are on your query. Take all detail values, and I'm going to select Plosion. Okay, and I'm going to tell it to go to details only. All right, next I'm going to add in some formulas. So for the formula column, I'm using Excel functions here to add in these formulas. And the key here is I'm going to highlight and put criteria on here to say copy the formulas to the included cells. Same thing over here on the other column where I'm using formulas. And lastly, I'm adding in labels, and I'm going to, that's in order to get the vendor ID and the vendor name come in. And I'm going to highlight and check, put labels in blank cells only, so I don't override anything that might already had hard code values in. Okay. And then finally, just a screenshot of if I unhid the row criteria and the column criteria, you can, I just wanted to have everybody be able to see that in the screens there. And then lastly, you can make it pretty by putting separating sections, that kind of thing, making sure that it's carried down. In order to get those kind of formatting carrying down on imploded rows, you can format the top cell in the row 1 at the top of the column there. Okay, so in column G there, you can see that that band, or the gray band, was carried all the way down through the imploded rows, and that was because I had formatted cell G1 in my layout. Okay, and then finally, to wrap up here, is the nice thing of conditional formatting. And I can use Excel to do that conditional formatting piece, and I'm doing that conditional formatting, specifying it on the top of the column that I was on. So highlighting that first cell, and then using the Excel conditional formatting functions, defining a new rule, specifying what is my rule based off of here. And I could potentially have that value, instead of hard coding it here, have it as a value on the report itself that you're able to put in and change. Okay, what else might you want to do? You might want to add scopes. Our query had department ID, as I mentioned, or you might want to add an NVS instance hook macro at the end that would kick off, and maybe do some more fancy report formatting. All right, I'm going to hand this back over to Cameron at this point. Cameron?
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Steve. Let me go ahead and show my screen. All right. All right. So that was a lot of good information, and we decided to put a lot of screenshots, a lot of information in there so you can take it and go and basically do all of these on your own. So that's the idea. So lots of detail in there. I'll try and go a little faster here through the final couple examples, and so we can get to a little bit of Q&A. All right, so leveraging scopes to email personalized reports. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, we can already email reports out. Email is a delivered functionality for nVision report requests. Reports can be delivered, to individual users or roles. So what's the big deal? It's that's just delivered functionality. That's true, and this is how you do it. So you put in the nVision report request itself. You can put in an email template by putting in your own or put a daisy chain or list out the email addresses. You can also use things like a user. So as long as the user ID in PeopleSoft has an email address linked to it, you can send it through there as well. Or you can use a whole role. So everybody all the users that have the role accounting will get this email or get this nVision report instance email to them. Okay, that's great. And one more example. So when you actually run the report just through normal distribution of any process you run in PeopleSoft, you can always go to the distribute by and put in users or roles in there as well. Okay, pretty straightforward. Again, delivered functionality. But what if you want your report, if you want it to be dynamic? In other words, if it met certain conditions, we want to email it out to certain people. So what am I talking about? Well, what if you wanted to send personalized requisition reports to the requesters? What if you wanted to send personalized expense reports to travelers, budget actual reports to department managers, maybe a workflow status? So, show me for anything that I've submitted, I want to get a report that shows, for unapproved transaction, whose queue it's in. And by an administrator can just set it up and send that all out to all the people who have current transactions outstanding and whose queue it's in. Okay, so to do that kind of stuff, you can't simply just use an email template, send it to these users, because you'd be sending the same report to everybody. You don't want to do that. You want to send individual, detailed, personalized reports. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So the way you're going to do that is you're going to follow these steps. You need first a view of the reporting data. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and you're going to say, well, I don't know how to create a view. Well, I got some screenshots in here how to do it. Even if you don't have access, you can simply work with the developer. I created this view that I'm going to show you here in about literally 60 seconds. It's very easy to do. Once you have your view, you're going to create a query on that view. You're going to build nVision based on that query. You're going to create a scope. You're going to do your report request. It's pull in the scope. And then, of course, you can set this up through recurrence, so you can actually generate this personalized reports on a recurring basis. Okay, let's take a look at an example. All right. So I've got a very simple query here that is looking at outstanding requisitions. And I could put any kind of criteria on one on this. For my demo database, I just pulled all the data. But the key is to link in from a requester some kind of user element into the email address. So in this case, it's a requester join to the PS opera defin to get the email address. Very simple to do, very simple join, nothing crazy. And so I've got a query, and if I look behind the scenes in the SQL, I've got all the SQL that's used to do the joins to pull this data set together. Okay, so I'm going to take that SQL and I'm going to work with my developer to create a view using this specific query data, the SQL. All right, so this is a little screenshot of how you create a view, which is a record in Application Designer. You're going to add the fields exactly as they were stated in your query. And you take the same exact SQL and you're going to pass that into the underlying SQL for that record. The trick here to do this right, to be able to use this as a scope, is you've got to take that email ID and you got to put an edit on it, a table edit. So, and you can even just make it refer to itself. So here we've got the CM rec email record, and we're making that in itself the table edit, okay? And this is going to be really important. If you don't do this, your scope will squawk at you. You won't be able to create a scope on this email address. All right. Next step. So now that I've got a view, and I'm skipping over the step of giving security to yourself through Access Manager to this view. So you'll need to do that. Once you have that, you're going to create a query that's going to pull in this the same view, just to select star all the values from that new record. And then you're going to create your nVision tabular report. Very simple to do. You can pretty this up. You can do whatever you want with it. But basically, you're just pulling in the fields that are part of that query. And so here you can see I've run the query without a scope, and I've got all the data. And now I'm pulling in all these different email addresses, okay, that are linked to the requesters. So you can see that I've got a total at the bottom. The count is for all of them, and average requisition line. So that might be an important report for purchasing group, but in general, it's not a personalized report. Chris Baker only wants to see his stuff. C. Roth only wants to see their stuff, et cetera. So how do we do that? So we've created this basic tabular report. Now we're going to go create a scope. And this is where, if we've done the table edit right, we can create a scope using that same record that we just created. And the field name is going to be the email ID. And the value table is going to, it's going to require a value table, and you're going to point to the same table, CM rec email, okay? Once we have that, we are going to run the report with email as the type. We're going to include that scope, the file template, adding the scope field value in there. Not actually important if you're going to do this, but I always like to do that just to look at the different reports and have that scope field value in there. And then the key is then pulling that scope field value into the email template, okay? And if you've done this right and followed these steps, you will get personalized emails that will take that report, it'll chunk it up based on the email address and send it out to those individuals. Here in this case, I changed Chris Baker's email address to myself so I could get the email. And here you can see the email that came out of our demonstration system. And here is my personalized report. Now I'm Chris Baker. Of course, my email address is mine, but this is Chris Baker. And I've set this up, and I've got a personalized report with just my segment of data. And of course, C. Roth would get his report, et cetera. Okay. So that's how you take your email address, make it a scope, and then use it as part of your distribution. Very easy to do, and it really pushes reports out. Of course, I could put a recurrence on this, make it nightly, make it weekly, make it monthly, and send these reports out to people. It's a real nice way to leverage nVision for people that would have no idea what nVision is. They get this report and have no idea it came from nVision. Okay. And of course, you could add drill down and other links in yours too. But all right. So next. Okay, so that's email. Okay, last thing, instance hooks. Okay, so instance hooks enable user-written macros to be used to be executed by nVision after delivering the data to report instance, but before saving the instance. Okay, that's a mouthful, but basically it's going to run a macro on every time you run the report. Okay. Now, please note that if you've switched over to OpenXML, you can't. The instance hooks won't work because it relies on Visual Basic, and under OpenXML you wouldn't be running Excel and Visual Basic. They are supported on both matrix and tabular layout sheets, and I'm going to show you an example of doing a pivot table automatically on a tabular layout. All right, so steps to create an instance hook. First, you need to save the layout as a macro-enabled workbook. By default, when you create a layout, it will not be a macro-enabled workbook, and so that's the first thing you have to do. You're then going to save it back as an nVision layout. So it's a little hack that you have to do. In fact, it's actually not mentioned in PeopleBooks. I don't know why, but that's something you have to do when you want to do these. You'll get rid of your extra column and row. You're going to record your macro, and that's where the real fun happens, recording the macros. And then you're going to then create, lastly, you're going to create a name like Steve showed you before, how you create names, and you're going to point it at the macro. Okay, so let's go through these. Step one, I've got a very simple report here. It's an XNV, and it's just a standard XNV. But in order to do this right, I'm going to have to save this first. So file save as, not add-ins nVision save as layout, but Excel file save as. And I'm going to change this to a macro-enabled workbook. Okay, that's the first thing I'm going to do. This will create a file name, same name as before, but with an .xlsm. Okay, step two. The very next step, go straight back in the same file, go back to add-ins nVision, and save as nVision layout. And you're going to save it right back as the original name, cmvouchers.xnv. You already have it. You're going to overwrite the existing file, and by doing that, you now have a layout that is now macro enabled. Now, what happens is when you do a save as layout, is of course it inserts an A and a column A and a row 1. So you have to simply just delete those again. And so we'll delete those and get rid of A and 1, and we're right back to where we started, where our criteria is back in A and 1. Okay, pretty straightforward. Okay, now to do this right, and really for nVision, instance hooks, a really very important tip here is you need to leverage names. Macros record specific cell references. And so really you need to, so if you make any changes to after you've created the macro, your macro will break. And so the important thing is to create these named ranges. And here I have the segment of data. I know I'm going to be populating data, and when I create 50 rows, my new data named range will have 50 rows. Okay. All right. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit on the developer tab. And if you don't have the developer tab, you can customize or change your layout or your ribbon and add the developer tab. You're going to record a macro. And I'm going to create a shell macro called hook that is going to be the place where we're going to put all of our macro code. Okay, so first thing, create a macro, hit record, and instantly after you do that, hit stop recording. And if you go into the macros and look at the macro you just created by clicking on edit, and you're going to see that it's got this little macro code, and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I don't understand code. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about that. You've got this little sub hook, and you've got these green little tick marks that are basically commenting out, and you've got your hook macro that has your description of this is where you're going to put all your code eventually. Okay. All right. Let's go back now to, we're going to run the report. It's very important that you do that first instance hook in the layout, but now we actually have data, and now we can record a macro on our instance, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to run our report where we actually have an instance, where we actually have data, and we're going to record a macro. We're going to call it just temp, because all we want is to grab that code, and we're going to take it back into our instance hook. Okay. So let me run this real quick. It's a simple example of how we're going to record a macro. I'm going to give it this temp name, and it's now recording. So I'm going to insert the pivot table. I'm going to refer to my named range data, very important. I'm going to insert now pivot table, and I'm just recording all my actions. So creating our departments, our count of vouchers, our sum of vouchers. And pretty straightforward. I'm going to then go stop my recording. And now I've got my my code that just created a pivot table on the data named range. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so now we've got this temp one. We're going to edit that, and now we've got all this code. And could I write all that code from scratch? No, of course not. I don't know how to write all that code from scratch. It doesn't matter. Creating the macro will create the code for you. You're going to take that code in between the sub temp and the end sub. You're going to take all that code, and you're going to put it into your instance hook in the layout. So here I'm in the instance, cmvouch.xlsm. And I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it back into my XNV instance hook, okay? So I've copied it over. I've created a little thing there. It says this section creates the pivot table. And of course, if I want to append to this later on and do some formatting or whatever, I'll just keep creating little sections with the different code, okay? So now we're going to test it. We're going to run it. Now that we've created that code into our instance hook or into our main layout, we're going to run it. And now I can just go and look up the macros and find that instance hook and run it, and boom, it gives me exactly what I want. It's a very important part of your testing process. So now that I have that and I know the macro is going to run right, the final step is to create a named range, a new name. You're going to go and hit new, and it has to be called this specific. It has to be called NVS instance hook. The scope has to be your sheet. So if you've renamed your sheet, you can rename that. And then it refers to then the macro, in this case, hook. Very simple to do that. Once I do that, the very next time I run this report, it will run that instance hook, that macro, every time, okay? And here you can see I've got now the pivot table automatically created on that tabular report. Okay, a couple other considerations. Make sure that if you want to, you can append extra bits of code by continuing to create the macro on your instance and continue to copy and paste that back into your base macro in the layout. Very important to do the code off of the instance and then put it into, copy and paste it into the layout. So, consider building a pivot table in the instance first before you do the instance hook. So create the pivot table and then just use an instance hook to refresh it. That gives you a little bit more control over what you see in the pivot table. A little easier to do. Think about charts. Charts, great way to have, make your nVision reports look really nice is to have charts. But, when you run a report, those charts don't automatically refresh. But Instance Hook will refresh the charts for you. So very easy to just record yourself refreshing and then getting that code into your report. And just lastly, I mentioned this before, remember to use names, very important. If you don't do that, your specific cell references will break when you go on later on. Okay, that's it. I'm sorry, we're going to run a little bit over time, but are there any questions? All right, so I do see one question here. Have you run into any nVision compatibility issues with Office 365 users? Let's see. Steve, do you have an answer to that?
I do not, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen it as an issue. I think the issue, we've seen more issues with the transition for a few years back from the old prior to 2007 layouts to the future, and those 2007 layouts persisted for quite a long time. So that was an issue. We also see an issue with the 64-bit versus 32-bit. That can become an issue when running nVision on the client. Of course, the new People tools, I believe 8.5.6 and beyond require a current 64-bit version, so that becomes an issue. All right, any other questions? If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in there. Let's see. We do have another question. We have a Tabular report that couldn't recognize the expression. Do you have a solution? Well, we're going to have to follow up on that one. I think we'll need more information on that to be able to answer that one. Let's see. So maybe we'll just follow up with the person that asked that question. All right. Let's see. Is it possible to get a recording? Yes, the recording will be sent out on this one, and you will get that. And I see that question came in from Christine about the Tabular report that couldn't recognize expression. So we'll follow up with you and take a look at your report and see if we can help you with that one. Okay, we're over time. So last thing I'll do is just mention that we do have a bunch of webinars and the virtual training coming. We do have an upcoming series of webinars. So you can see here we're doing Kibana next week. We're doing Emerging Tech with Unified Navigation Chatbots on the 29th. And then we'll be doing creating a strategic roadmap. The rest of that got cut off, but creating a strategic roadmap on the 12th of June, and you can sign up there under that link. Again, you'll be getting this deck, and you'll be able to get all these links. We also, for any of these webinars, including this one, it will show up on our recorded webinars, and we've already been doing a few. You can see there we've got one on decustomization, PTF, and best practices. That's all under our recorded webinars. Again, there's the link that you can click on, and this nVision recording will be on there as well. If you want to pass this, if you want to tell somebody about this webinar or any other webinars that you think might be relevant for people in your organization, go ahead and just send them that link, and they can click on those webinars and just and open up the webinar and view it. Upcoming training, so we talked about this before, it's just visual. We'll go through this pretty quickly, but query and nVision, you've got the nVision class on 15th and 17th. You've got query 101, 201, and then 301 pivot grid on the 19th and 26th. We've got decustomization. You can see about what topics are going to be in our decustomization class. Again, really low price point on these. Feel free to jump on that link and take a look at the agendas and the pricing. Very easy to do that. And always let us know if you want to get access to these. We do have some discounts available. PTF and lease administration as well. So if anybody's interested in those topics, feel free. And I can see I didn't change my topics on there, so I apologize about that. All right, that's it. We're over time by a couple minutes. Thank you, everybody. We do have a quarter-to-date slides. Feel free to look at those in the deck, in the appendix, and follow up if you have any questions. We will be following up with, I see a couple more questions coming in. We'll follow up with you guys as after this webinar ends. All right, thank you. We're gonna end the webinar now. Appreciate everybody's time. Have a great day.
Thank you all.